The room went quiet so fast that I could hear my own heartbeat. 100 people were seated around long tables decorated with white candles and gold centerpieces. Employees, relatives, and the most important client our family had ever landed. The wine was still warm in the glasses. The food had just been served. And my father, Charles Moore, stood at the head of the table with a microphone in his hand and a wide smile on his face. He had been making jokes all evening. Charming ones. The kind that made everyone feel like they were part of something special. But this last one was not charming. This one was pointed directly at me. "Hayley is talented, don't get me wrong," he said, still smiling. "But she's too sensitive for this business. Too soft. Honestly, she wouldn't survive a single week without me holding things together." Laughter rippled around the table. Not cruel laughter, more like the nervous kind, where people are not sure if it is a joke or not. My brother Brandon caught my eye from across the table and smirked. He was enjoying every second of it. My name is Hayley Moore. I was 28 years old that evening, and I had spent the last 4 years quietly holding our family company together while everyone else smiled for the cameras. That night was the night the truth finally walked into the room on its own. Moore and Lane was a supply company. We handled vendor relationships, coordinated shipments, and managed large-scale orders for hospitality clients across the state. My father started it from nothing, and he built it into something real over 20 years. I respected that. I genuinely did. But somewhere along the way, Charles Moore stopped building the company and started performing it. He became more focused on reputation than on the systems that kept everything running. Every meeting became a show. Every handshake became a photo opportunity. Every dinner like this one became a stage. That left a gap, and I stepped into it quietly, the way I always did. Our biggest client was Hayes Luxury Hotels. Victoria Hayes ran the group personally. She was sharp, direct, and completely intolerant of excuses. Her hotels were known for perfection, and she expected the same from every vendor she worked with. Losing her account would have cost us nearly 40% of our revenue. My father had handed her account to Brandon 18 months before this dinner. Brandon was loud, confident, and great at promising things. What he was not great at was actually delivering them. Over those 18 months, I had stepped in quietly every single time something went wrong, which was often. Victoria knew who was really keeping things running. That evening, she was sitting 3 seats from my father when he made his joke about me. Brandon had always been the one my father showed off. Even as kids, that was how it worked. If Brandon scored a goal, my father replayed the story at every dinner table for a month. If I won something at school, my father would smile, say "That's great, honey," and then ask Brandon about his practice schedule. I did not grow up angry about it. I grew up practical. I learned early that some people get the spotlight and some people get the work, and if you are honest with yourself, the work is what actually keeps things standing. By the time I joined Moore and Lane 4 years ago, I already understood my role. I was not the face. I was the foundation. I answered the calls no one else wanted to answer. I fixed the problems that happened after the promises were made. I stayed late when the paperwork did not match the delivery records. I called vendors back when Brandon forgot to return their messages. My father saw all of it. He just had a different name for it. He called it helping out. Not managing. Not leading. Helping out. Like I was an assistant doing small favors rather than the person holding the whole operation together. That evening, with his microphone and his smile, he made sure everyone else saw me the same way he did. Just as my father raised his glass toward Brandon and said the words "our future leader," something happened that nobody in that room expected. Victoria Hayes pushed back her chair and stood up. She was calm. That was what made it powerful. She did not shout or wave her hands. She just stood, set down her wine glass, and looked directly at my father with the steady patience of someone who had decided exactly what she was going to say. "That's strange, Charles," she said clearly. "Because Hayley is the only reason my company is still your client." The silence that followed was different from any silence I had ever been inside. It was not a polite pause before applause. It was the silence of a room catching its breath. Victoria did not sit back down. She continued. She explained that over the past year, Haley had been the person answering her emergency calls at 9 in the evening. Haley had corrected 2 major shipment errors before they reached the hotels. Haley had spent an entire weekend managing a hotel manager in Beaumont who was ready to cancel a major order over a delayed delivery. My father tried to smile through it. He said something about basic assistance. Victoria turned to him and said, quietly and firmly, "Haley did not assist the company, Charles. She saved it." That was the first time the truth had walked into a room my family could not push it back out of. I remember sitting very still during Victoria's speech. My hands were folded in my lap. I kept my face neutral because I knew everyone was watching me, waiting to see how I would react. I did not smile too much or look too satisfied, because that was not what the moment needed. What I felt inside was harder to name. It was not a triumph, exactly. It was closer to grief mixed with relief. Grief because it had taken this long. Relief because someone had finally said it out loud in a way that could not be undone. Brandon's expression had changed completely. The smirk was gone. His jaw was tight. He was staring at Victoria with the look of someone who had just realized the rules of the game had quietly changed while he was not paying attention. My father's smile had frozen on his face like a photograph taken at the wrong moment. He was still holding his glass. He had not put it down yet. I had spent 4 years working in a company where my results were welcomed and my name was forgotten. For years of watching Brandon take credit in meetings for solutions I had written the night before. For years of being called helpful when the word I had earned was capable. And in 4 minutes, Victoria Hayes had said more clearly than I ever could what those 4 years had looked like from the outside. I did not feel like celebrating. I felt like something had cracked open and the real light was finally getting in. After the dinner ended and people began filtering out to the parking lot, Victoria touched my arm near the door and asked me to step outside with her. The evening was cool. She stood with her hands in her jacket pockets, and she got straight to the point, the way she always did. She told me that Hayes Luxury Hotels had almost ended its contract with Moore and Lane 3 separate times in the past year. The first time was after a shipment arrived 2 days late to a property in Dallas. The second was after Brandon promised a custom order for a resort in Austin that had never actually been confirmed with a supplier. The third was after a hotel manager in San Antonio sent her a complaint about rude handling of a delivery dispute. All 3 times, I had stepped in. All 3 times, the problem was quietly resolved before Victoria had to make the final call. She knew it was me. She had always known. Then she looked at me directly and asked, "Why is your father putting the weakest person in charge and hiding the strongest one?" I did not have an easy answer. I had spent years telling myself that if I was patient, if I stayed steady, if I kept doing good work, my father would eventually see what was real. Standing there in the parking lot under the yellow lights, I started to understand that patience might not be earning me respect. It might just be making it easier for them to erase me. The morning after dinner, my father called me into his office at 8 o'clock sharp. I had been awake since 5. I had replayed the evening enough times to know exactly what was coming. Charles Moore did not like being corrected. He especially did not like being corrected in front of clients. The fact that he had not corrected himself first, the fact that a woman he needed had to do it for him, made everything worse. He did not apologize. He sat behind his desk with his reading glasses on, looking at papers he was not actually reading, and he accused me of embarrassing him in front of Victoria. I told him the truth calmly. I said that I had not spoken during Victoria's comments. I had simply sat there while she said what she observed. He told me that was exactly the problem. That I should have redirected the conversation. That I should have protected the family's image. That one client's compliment did not make me a leader. Then he told me he had made a decision. Brandon would officially become director of operations. I stared at him. I knew he was wrong. He knew he was wrong. I could see it in the way he adjusted his glasses without looking at me directly. But Charles Moore had never once, in my entire life, admitted he was wrong about Brandon. He was not about to start now. Brandon moved fast. That was one thing I could say about my brother. When he wanted something, he went after it without stopping to think about the damage. By the end of his first week as director of operations, He had taken over my corner office, moved me to a small desk near the file storage room, and announced that all major client communication would now flow through him. I watched vendors call the main line and get transferred to Brandon, who gave them confident, vague answers and promised timelines he had never checked. I watched hotel managers send emails that went unread for 2 days. I watched Brandon walk into meetings holding folders he had not opened. Mason Reed, our operations supervisor, came to my new desk on Thursday afternoon and sat across from me with the careful expression of someone choosing their words. Mason was steady and experienced. He had been with Moore and Lane for 11 years. He did not gossip or complain. When he came to find me, it meant something was already going wrong. He told me quietly that 3 vendors had called that week asking about the same upcoming shipment to Hayes Luxury Hotels. Brandon had told each of them a different pickup date. None of the dates matched the actual schedule. I opened my laptop and looked at the files I still had access to. The situation was already forming into a knot, the kind that tightened the longer you ignored it. I began preparing a quiet note to pass to the right people before it became a real problem. I thought about the first time I understood how much damage Brandon could do. It was 18 months before this. A major hotel renovation project for a client in Houston had been running on a tight timeline. The supplier we used for flooring materials had sent Brandon a written warning that their delivery would be delayed by 2 weeks because of a warehouse issue. Brandon had ignored it. I found out by accident, the way I found out about most things. A warehouse employee named Terry mentioned it to me in passing, thinking I already knew. I did not already know. The delivery fell apart exactly the way the warning said it would. Brandon blamed Terry in front of 3 managers and said the warehouse had failed to communicate properly. Terry stood there looking at the floor, and I stood in the doorway, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. I spent the next 48 hours finding an alternate supplier, arranging an emergency order through a contact I had built 2 years before, and coordinating a legal expedited delivery that kept the client from cancelling. Nobody in the office knew. The hotel manager called Charles to say how impressed he was that the problem had been caught and fixed so quickly. Charles praised Brandon in the team meeting the following morning. He said Brandon had handled pressure like a professional. I stood in the doorway holding the corrected paperwork. I did not say anything. I just went back to my desk and kept working. The Hayes Luxury Hotel shipment problem grew exactly the way I knew it would when nobody did anything early enough. A major resort in the Hill Country was scheduled to open in 3 weeks. It needed custom fixtures, specialty linens, and commercial equipment from 4 different vendors, all coordinated to arrive within a 2-day window before the soft opening. Brandon had promised Victoria's team the delivery dates 2 weeks earlier without checking with any of the vendors first. He had written dates on a proposal document and sent it to Hayes as confirmed. None of it was confirmed. When Mason told me the truth of where things stood, the gap between what Brandon had promised and what was actually scheduled was 10 days. I spent the weekend putting together a full recovery plan. Vendor contacts, backup suppliers, cost breakdowns, rerouting options, and realistic timelines that could still make the resort opening work. It was careful, detailed work, and it took everything I knew about our supplier network to put it together. On Monday morning, before I could send a single word of it to anyone, my father called me into his office and told me that I was removed from the Hayes account entirely. He said I was panicking again. He said I was creating problems where there were none. He had not asked to see the plan. He had not asked what the vendors said. He had not asked anything. He had simply shut the door. 2 days later, Victoria called my personal phone. She never called my personal phone. She had the number because I had given it to her 18 months before, during a late-night crisis, and told her to use it only if she could not reach anyone else. She had never needed to use it until now. Her voice was controlled but tight. Brandon had stopped answering her team's messages for 4 days. Her operations director had called Moore and Lane 6 times. Her assistant had sent 3 emails. Nothing. She knew what was happening. She had been watching this long enough to understand the shape of it. She was not calling to complain. She was calling because time was running out and she needed someone who would tell her the truth. I was honest with her. I told her I had been removed from the Hayes account and had no official authority at Moore and Lane to act on anything. She said, I am not calling because of your title, Haley. I am calling because you are the only one who tells me the truth. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told her I would help, but only if everything was handled properly. No workarounds. No quiet fixes that kept Brandon's mistakes hidden. I would not do anything illegal, secretive, or embarrassing. If we were going to solve this, we were going to solve it in the open. She agreed immediately. Getting the recovery done cleanly took every bit of discipline I had. I could not just pick up the phone and start calling vendors. I had no system access. I had no official role on the account. If I acted without documentation, Brandon would twist it and my father would use it to remove me from the building entirely. So I did it right. I called the accounting manager, Patricia, and explained the situation calmly. She confirmed that the resort opening date was a contractual obligation. I drafted a written emergency request and got Victoria's signature on it first, because her written authorization was the anchor everything else needed to hang from. Then I went to Mason. He was the one person who still had full operations access and also understood exactly what we were dealing with. He had been watching the situation build for 2 weeks and he was ready. We identified 2 backup vendors who could reroute supplies in time. One of them I had used before in a different emergency and they knew me. They picked up on the first call. Within 36 hours, we had a new delivery plan confirmed, signed, and submitted through proper company channels with written approval from the client, the accounting department, and the operations supervisor. The resort opening came off without a problem. Guests arrived to a perfectly prepared property. Victoria's team sent a short, professional note of thanks to Moore and Lane. Nobody outside the building knew how close it had come to being a disaster. Brandon found out I was involved within a day of the opening. I do not know who told him. It might have been someone who saw the vendor call logs. It might have been someone who noticed my name on the emergency authorization paperwork. It does not matter. What matters is what he did with the information. He went to my father. He told Charles that I had interfered in the Hayes account because I wanted him to fail. He said I had gone around him deliberately and humiliated him in front of the client. He made it sound like a personal attack rather than a rescue. My father did not call me in to hear my side first. He came to my small desk near the file room and stood over me with his arms crossed. He said I had undermined my brother. I pulled out the signed approvals. Victoria's written authorization. Patricia's confirmation from accounting. Mason's operations sign-off. Everything documented, everything clean, everything done the right way. My father barely glanced at the papers. He said that family loyalty mattered more than making Brandon look incompetent. He said I should have let the problem unfold and then reported it rather than stepping in. I looked at him and understood, for the first time with complete clarity, what was actually happening. He was not confused about the facts. He had seen the facts. He simply preferred Brandon being wrong to me being right. That hurt more than anything he had said at the dinner. I wrote my resignation letter that evening. I did not write it in anger. I wrote it carefully, the way I did everything else. I explained that I had spent 4 years being responsible for problems I was not permitted to officially solve, taking blame for failures I had tried to prevent, and accepting invisibility as the price of staying close to work I cared about. I said I could not continue. The next morning, I placed the letter on my father's desk. He read it, looked up, and laughed. Not a mean laugh. Almost a pity. He said I would be back within weeks because I was too soft for the real world. I did not argue with him. I had spent enough of my life trying to prove things to people who had already decided what they believed. I went back to my small desk, packed one box, and left my keycard in the center of my father's desk on the way out. The box held my planner, one framed photo, and a folder of documents. My own written work. Client praise that had been sent specifically to me. Documented solutions I had created. Nothing that belonged to Moore and Lane. Nothing I had not earned personally. I walked out of the building on a Tuesday afternoon into bright sunlight and did not look back. The cracks appeared fast. Within the first week, vendors who had always reached me directly did not know who to contact. Some called the main line and got voicemail. Some sent emails that sat in Brandon's inbox for days. A hotel manager in Fort Worth called 3 times about a delivery discrepancy and eventually told his assistant to escalate the complaint to Hayes Corporate. Mason was working 18-hour days trying to absorb the gaps. He was good at his job, one of the best I knew, but he had always been in the engine room. I used the navigation system. Those are different things, and you cannot replace one with the other. Within 2 weeks, client complaints had doubled. 2 vendors changed their payment terms because they no longer trusted the communication on our end. A delivery that should have taken 3 days took 9 because nobody caught the routing error in time. My father told employees that my resignation was a personal choice and would not affect the business. He told Brandon to hold steady. He told himself, I imagine, that things would settle. Things did not settle. What my father had always called my softness, my double-checking, my careful calls to vendors, my late-night corrections, my early morning follow-ups, had not been a weakness at all. It had been the cushion between the company and every hard landing it had never felt. Without me, they started feeling them. Victoria called me about 10 days after I left Moore and Lane. She had heard about the resignation through her operations director, who had tried reaching Moore and Lane for routine communication and discovered that nobody seemed to know the answer to anything anymore. She did not ask me to come back. She knew better than that. She asked me to lunch. We met at a quiet restaurant near downtown. She ordered coffee and got straight to the point. She told me she wanted to offer me a consulting contract directly with Hayes Luxury Hotels. My job would be to help them manage vendor relationships across their properties and create systems to prevent supply chain failures before they started. I hesitated. I was not hesitating because I was afraid of the work. I was hesitating because I did not want anyone to accuse me of stealing my father's client. I had left Moore and Lane cleanly. I intended to stay clean. I told Victoria exactly that. She nodded and said she understood. Then she said, plainly, that Charles Moore had damaged the relationship between Hayes Luxury Hotels and Moore and Lane himself through 18 months of broken promises and missed deliveries. She had not left his company because I left. She had stayed as long as she had because of me. I asked for 2 days to review the contract terms and confirm there was no legal conflict with my former employment. There was none. I accepted. A few weeks into my new work with Hayes Luxury Hotels, I was reviewing their old contract with Moore and Lane when I noticed something I had not seen before. It was a performance clause. Standard language, the kind that appears in most commercial service agreements and gets overlooked until someone needs it. This one said that if Moore and Lane failed 3 documented major service requirements in a single quarter, Hayes could cancel the contract without penalty or notice. Brandon had already caused 2 documented failures that quarter. The shipment crisis I had helped resolve had been documented in writing. The Fort Worth complaint had also been formally recorded in Hayes' vendor management system. A 3rd failure was building. Brandon had promised specialty supplies for another hill country property without checking the inventory. The order was already 2 weeks behind where it needed to be, and nobody at Moore and Lane seemed to understand the risk they were sitting on. I was not inside the company anymore. I could not fix it. I was not going to pretend I could. But I understood what was coming, and I understood what it would mean. Moore and Lane were standing on the edge of losing its largest account. My father was still smiling through board meetings as though the ground beneath him was solid. I said nothing. I documented what I knew. And I waited. My father came to my apartment on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after I left the company. He did not call first. He rang the doorbell, and when I opened the door, he looked like someone who had rehearsed the beginning of a speech and already forgotten it. He told me to stop working with Victoria. He said I was trying to destroy the family business. He said I was acting out of bitterness and revenge and that it was beneath me. I stood in my doorway and listened to all of it without interrupting. Then I told him I was doing honest, legal work for a client who had approached me and hired me properly. I was not hiding anything. I was not breaking any agreement. I was working. He said, the way he always did when he wanted to end a conversation, "You are nothing without my name." I looked at him for a long moment. He was standing in the hallway of my apartment building, having driven over unannounced to pressure me into silence. I thought about all the years I had folded under that pressure. All the times that sentence, or something like it, had made me smaller. Then I said, quietly, "Then why are you here asking me to stop?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. He left without another word. It was the first time in my life I had watched him walk away without an answer. 2 weeks after that visit, Brandon told Charles I had taken company documents before resigning. It was not true. Every document I had used in my new work had come from one of 3 places. My own personal work records that I had created, materials provided directly by Hayes Luxury Hotels, or publicly available contract information. Nothing belonged to Moore and Lane. Charles threatened legal action. He sent a letter through the company's attorney demanding I provide an accounting of all documents in my possession that could be considered company property. I sent back a full response within 72 hours. I listed every document by name, explained its origin, and attached evidence for each one. The response was clear, organized, and calm. The accusation collapsed within a week. Victoria was furious when she found out. Not at me. At Charles. She told her own legal team what had happened and made clear that attempting to intimidate a consultant working for Hayes Luxury Hotels was not something she would overlook quietly. Charles received a carefully worded note from Hayes' attorney that said, in corporate language, exactly what Victoria had said to me directly. He backed down. Several Moore and Lane employees reached out to me privately around that time. They told me Brandon was forcing staff to work late without proper authorization, blaming others for missed deadlines, and pressuring vendors to hide delays. I did not respond with gossip. I told each of them the same thing. Document everything, protect yourselves, and report concerns through proper channels. The third failure happened in the final week of the quarter. Brandon had promised supplies for the newest Hayes property, a boutique resort outside San Marcos, without confirming inventory or delivery capacity. When the deadline arrived, the shipment was incomplete. The property team called Hayes Corporate. Hayes Corporate opened a formal complaint file. That was the third documented major service failure. Victoria triggered the performance clause. Moore and Lane lost the Hayes Luxury Hotels account officially, with no penalty to Hayes and no legal recourse for Moore and Lane. My father did not call me when it happened. I found out through Mason, who texted me one word, "Done." I sat with it for a while. I did not feel satisfied. I want to be honest about that. Watching something I had worked hard to build get destroyed is not a feeling that comes with triumph attached. I had given 4 years of real effort to that company and that relationship. Watching it collapse because my father chose pride over sense was painful in a way that did not go away quickly. But I also understood that I had done everything I could, for as long as I could, in the right way. I could not protect a company from its own leadership forever. At some point, the consequences had to land where they belonged. Victoria organized a vendor appreciation event for Hayes Luxury Hotels about 6 weeks after the contract ended with Moore and Lane. She invited me as a guest. She also, I found out later, invited Charles. I did not know my father would be there until I arrived and saw him near the entrance, standing with the careful posture of someone who had rehearsed looking relaxed. We nodded at each other but did not speak. Victoria gave a short speech partway through the evening. She thanked several people by name. When she reached me, she said, "Haley Moore stayed calm under pressure, told the truth when it was inconvenient, and saved us from costly mistakes during one of the most difficult transition periods we have experienced with a vendor in years." The room applauded. My father was standing 20 feet away. I did not look at him during the applause. I did not need to. I had not come to the event for that moment. I had come because Victoria had asked me to and because I was genuinely proud of the work we had done together. But I felt the weight of it. The same daughter he had called too soft, too sensitive, too small for the real world, was being praised by the client he could not afford to lose. He had to stand there and hear it. There was nothing to dismiss. There was no version of events where that was not completely, simply true. After the event, my father found me near the parking lot. He asked if we could talk privately. I said yes because I meant what I had said all along. I was not his enemy. I never had been. He told me he wanted me to come back to Moore and Lane. He said it was for the family. He said the company needed steadiness and that I was the best person to provide it. He did not apologize. He did not offer me a title. He did not offer me real authority. He did not acknowledge that the past 4 years had happened the way they happened. He was asking me to come back as the same quiet fixer I had always been, the person who solved the problems and disappeared from the credit, the person who could be blamed when things went wrong and overlooked when things went right. I told him clearly and calmly that I would never return on those terms. If Moore and Lane wanted my help as an outside consultant, they could hire my business properly. Written contract. Defined authority. Full transparency. A role where my name was on the solutions as well as the problems. He looked at me for a long moment. I could see him calculating, weighing his pride against his options. He did not answer. He walked back toward the building. I drove home without rushing. I made tea. I sat by the window and felt, for the first time in a long while, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The truth inside Moore and Lane came from an unexpected place. When the advisory board began meeting to assess the Hayes contract loss and what it meant for the company, Brandon panicked. Facing the possibility of being removed from operations, he did something I did not expect. He told the truth. He told Charles, in front of 2 board members, that Haley had been handling the real operational work for years. He said that Charles should not have pushed her out. He said the company had survived because of her systems, her vendor relationships, and her ability to hold everything together when he could not. It was a selfish confession. He was protecting himself, not honoring me. But it was real. Charles heard his golden son, the one he had always chosen, say out loud what I had been too loyal to shout across 4 years of meetings and quiet mornings and late nights. The company had run on my work. The board did not rely only on Brandon's admission. Mason appeared at the formal board meeting with a documented timeline. Haley's early warnings about the Hayes account. Her recovery plans. Her written recommendations that had been ignored. Her solutions that had been implemented without her name attached. The board saw that every risk I had identified had come true. Every solution I had offered had been blocked. The company had not lost Hayes because I left. It had lost Hayes because Charles had refused to listen while I was still there. The board approached me 2 weeks after their meeting. They asked if I would consider serving as an outside consultant to help stabilize Moore and Lane during a recovery period. Not as an employee. Not returning to the family business on the old terms. As an outside professional hired under a proper agreement. My father expected me to say no. I did not say no. I agreed, under conditions that I wrote out myself and submitted in writing before any handshake happened. Brandon had to be removed from the Director of Operations role. Staff could not be blamed for leadership failures. Vendor relationships had to be repaired honestly, with direct outreach and real accountability, not vague reassurances. Charles had to step back from daily operational control during the recovery period. Every condition had to be agreed to in writing before I would begin. The board agreed. My father signed the document. He did not look at me when he signed it. I did not need him to. The signature was what mattered. I did not agree to those conditions because I wanted revenge. I agreed to them because they were the only terms under which the company could actually recover. And if there was anything I still cared about after everything that had happened, it was that the people who worked at Moore and Lane, Mason, and the vendors, and the staff who had documented their concerns and followed proper channels, deserved better than to keep absorbing the cost of bad leadership. Months later, Moore and Lane were smaller. It was quieter. It was more honest. Brandon had lost the title he never earned. He remained connected to the company in a reduced capacity because my father could not fully let go of the story he had told about his son, but his power over daily operations was gone. The staff breathed easier. Charles was still present, but everyone understood that his authority was no longer the final word. The board had made that structural change, and the document he had signed made it permanent. My consulting business has grown steadily. Hayes Luxury Hotels was my anchor client, but I had added 3 others, each one built on the same foundation. Honest communication, documented agreements, and real accountability at every level. At a new business development event near the end of that year, Victoria introduced me to a room full of hospitality executives. She said, "This is Haley Moore. She is the woman who saved a company that underestimated her." I smiled. Not because it was a perfect ending. Life does not work that way, and I had learned enough to know that real stories do not close neatly like doors. I smiled because I had not won by becoming hard, or cruel, or dishonest. I had not won by burning anything down or shouting anything from a rooftop or waiting for someone to finally notice me. I had won by staying steady. By doing the right thing when it was inconvenient. By refusing to be invisible while also refusing to become something I was not. The softest thing about me, it turned out, was never a weakness at all. It was the reason I was still standing.